Hey, Grandpa, don't you think you're a little too old to be drinking? Better head home. Where's your walker? Laughter burst through Anchor's Rest, a busy bar near the Norfolk Naval Base. Lieutenant Taylor slapped his hand on the counter, pointing at the white-haired man sitting alone in the corner, sipping his bourbon quietly after a long, rough day. The veteran didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the glass of whiskey. The other officers around Taylor burst out laughing, slapping each other on the back. They were all young, freshly promoted, full of pride and cheap confidence. "Look at this, guys," Taylor went on, encouraged by the crowd. "I bet he never even served. Probably bought that old jacket from a thrift store." The jacket in question was a worn brown leather one, its sleeves patched, with a faded insignia barely visible on the chest. Lieutenant Miller, sitting to Taylor's left, stood up a bit unsteady. The beer had clearly gone to his head. "You know what cracks me up?" he said. "These old guys who live off stories from the past like they were heroes or something." "Yeah," Park agreed, adjusting his glasses. "My grandpa's the same way, keeps telling the same stories 1,000 times. After a while, you realize half of it's made up." The bartender, named Doug, frowned and looked over at the veteran but didn't say a word. He'd known that man for years. Every Thursday, same routine. He'd come in, order one bourbon, pay in cash, and never cause trouble. Taylor, mistaking the veteran's silence for weakness, decided to push further. "Hey, I'm talking to you, sir," he said, drawing out the last word with sarcasm. "It's not polite to ignore officers of the United States Navy." Finally, the veteran turned his head slowly. His face was carved by time, deep wrinkles, steady eyes. He didn't speak, just looked at Taylor with a neutral expression that somehow carried more weight than any insult could. "Wow, he's staring me down," Taylor mocked, turning to his friends. "I'm terrified." Miller leaned forward. "Let me see that patch," he said, pointing at the faded emblem on the man's chest. "Can barely read it. What squadron was that?" The veteran took a slow sip of bourbon, set the glass down carefully, and finally spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, but firm. "VF-41. VF-41, Miller repeated, pretending to think. "Never heard of it. Must have been some cargo unit or something." Taylor stepped closer, now standing beside the veteran's table. The smell of cheap beer lingered around him. "Everyone's got a call sign, right? What was yours, Grandpa? Turtle, Slug?" His buddies burst out laughing again. A few other customers began to watch, some with uneasy looks. Doug stopped wiping glasses and watched intently. "Come on," Taylor pressed, feeling emboldened by his growing audience. "Tell us, what was your call sign? Or did you never have one because you never really served?" Miller joined in. Maybe it was desk job, since he probably never left the office. The bar had grown quieter now. Conversations at nearby tables faded. A few of the older patrons were watching with stern expressions. The veteran finally lifted his eyes, locking them on Taylor's. There was no anger, no fear, no embarrassment. Just a deep, unsettling calm. "Iron 6, he said simply. The change was instant and complete. Taylor's smirk froze. Park went pale, his mouth slowly opening. Miller jumped to his feet so fast that his chair clattered to the floor. Doug closed his eyes briefly and shook his head, as if he'd tried to warn them. Other patrons, and especially the older ones, began to turn. A man at a distant table stood up slowly, hand pressed to his chest in a reflex of respect. The veteran continued. "Operation Linebacker 2, December 1972, 11 days over Hanoi." "Tough times," he said quietly, looking down at his bourbon. Miller was trembling now. Park had backed up until he was against the wall. Taylor stood frozen, all color drained from his face. The silence inside Anchor's Rest was heavy, suffocating. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. "Sir," Miller stammered, voice breaking. "We didn't know." "No," the veteran interrupted softly. "You didn't know. But you thought you did." He took another slow sip. "You thought an old man could only be a joke to you." Doug finally found his voice. "Admiral," he said respectfully, "next round's on me." The veteran, Admiral Connor Mays, looked at the young officers. Sit down and listen. The officers obeyed instantly, scrambling for seats. The noise in the bar gradually returned, but it was subdued now, respectful. Mays looked down at the whiskey in his hand, and for a moment he seemed 1,000 miles away from that place. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were seeing something no one else could. December 1972, he began quietly. I was a squadron commander, flew an F-4 Phantom. Taylor discreetly wiped away a tear, forcing himself to hold eye contact. Hanoi wasn't like the simulators you train on, Mays continued. On the 10th day of the operation, we lost Sergeant Harris, newly married. He paused, turning the glass slowly between his fingers. Iron 6 wasn't just a call sign, Mays said. It was a responsibility. An older man at a nearby table, a veteran himself, judging by his Navy cap, wiped his eyes quietly. You studied linebacker too at the academy, didn't you? Mays asked. Yes, sir, Taylor replied softly. And what do the books say? That it was a strategic victory? That we forced the enemy to the negotiating table? Mays gave a faint, bitter smile. That's right. It was all of that. But you know what the books don't say. They don't tell you about Captain James. He used to sing Frank Sinatra over the radio to keep everyone calm during missions. They don't tell you he carried a picture of his 2-year-old daughter in his flight suit pocket. They don't tell you about Sergeant Smith. Laughed too loud, told bad jokes, but he'd be the first one to risk his life to cover your 6. Mays took another sip, his hands completely steady despite the emotion in his voice. On the 10th day, we flew the heaviest mission. Targets deep in the heart of Hanoi. The anti-aircraft fire was so thick, you could see the explosions forming a wall in the sky. Doug had stopped working entirely now, leaning on the counter, listening intently. We were ordered to hit a munitions depot, 3-building complex. Intel said it was critical. Taking it out could shorten the war. Mays drew a long breath. Maybe it did. I don't know. What I do know is that it cost my friend Harris his life. I heard his last transmission, Mays said quietly. Iron 6, target destroyed. It was an honor to fly with you. They gave me a medal for that mission, Mays went on, his voice heavy with sorrow. He looked straight at Taylor again. So when you ask what my call sign was, understand this. It's not just a nickname, it's a memorial. It's every man I trusted my life with, and every man who trusted me with his. It's every family I visited afterward, looking into the eyes of mothers, wives, and children, trying to explain why their man didn't make it home. Iron 6, Mays repeated softly, is the weight I carry every day. That's why I come here every Thursday. That's why I drink the same bourbon my friend used to drink. You laugh at an old man, he said, voice low. But you have no idea what story that man might carry. Doug quietly poured another bourbon for Mays and refused to take his money when he tried to pay. The bar stayed wrapped in heavy silence. The distant sound of waves breaking along the coast seemed like the only noise that dared to exist. Miller wiped his sweaty hands on his pants. Taylor, once cocky, now stared down at the floor, unable to face the man in front of him. Park took off his cap and held it in both hands, as if standing at a funeral. Connor Mays took a slow breath. You remind me of us back when it all started, full of confidence, thinking the world makes sense until the day the sky falls on you. He stood up slowly. Even with shoulders bent by age, there was something unshakable in his posture. The presence of someone who had faced the impossible and come back to tell the story. Across the bar, Doug quietly pulled something from a wooden box. He walked over and placed it on the table. An old gray flight helmet, the name Mays hand-painted across it. The young officers stared, speechless. I've kept this since the day he saved my life, Doug said softly. I was a mechanic at Nellis. His F-4 came back in serious trouble and he refused to eject until his wingman was clear. I saw it all. Never forgot. The silence broke with the scrape of chairs moving. One by one, the young officers stood and came to attention. Taylor was the first to speak, his voice trembling. Permission to apologize, sir. Granted, Mays said. But remember, apologies aren't enough. Respect is earned through action. Taylor nodded, shame mixing with something deeper, genuine admiration. At that moment, the bar door opened. A group of older sailors stepped in, still in uniform, just back from an event at the base. One of them stopped in his tracks when he saw Mays. "Sir?" "Commander Mays?" "No longer a commander," Mays replied with a faint smile. "Just an old man who enjoys bourbon." But the sailor wouldn't let him slip by in modesty. He turned to the others, his voice full of respect. "Gentlemen, you're standing in front of the man who kept VF-41 in the air when nobody thought it could be done. Iron 6 isn't just a name. It's a chapter in Navy history." A murmur spread through the bar. Even the tourists who didn't fully grasp what was happening could feel the weight of the moment. Doug raised a hand to quiet everyone and said softly, "Let's have silence, please." Then he lifted his glass. "To all veterans who served this country," he said, his voice carrying both a toast and a prayer. Everyone followed, some raising their glasses, others simply placing a hand over their hearts. Connor Mays stood for a moment, looking around at the faces surrounding him, young and old, civilians and servicemen alike, all bound together by a quiet respect that filled every corner of Anchor's Rest. When the toast ended, Mays placed some cash on the table and rose to his feet. "Doug, thank you for the bourbon." "Sir, it's the least I can do," the bartender replied. Outside, the sound of the waves kept their steady, eternal rhythm. Inside Anchor's Rest, veterans shared stories, civilians listened with renewed respect, and a man known as Iron 6 continued his silent watch. Because some stories don't need to be told with words, but sometimes, on an ordinary night in a bar, those stories find ears ready to listen, and hearts willing to understand. As he stepped out, the cold ocean wind brushed against his worn leather jacket. The parking lot was still and quiet. His 1969 Pontiac GTO waited for him under the dim streetlight. That night, 3 young officers had learned the most important lesson of all, that behind every veteran lies a story of courage, sacrifice, and a love of country that spans generations. A story that deserves not mockery, but respect and everlasting reverence. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next.